Check this.
Socially triggered, and this video is going to be a response video to the academic agent. He posed two questions regarding race realism, and he tries to point out that he doesn't believe in race realism and that IQ has an impact on the success of a country. He believes that more the government and the influence of government has a greater effect on whether a country is successful or not. And that as well, it impacts on the actual IQ of the people within that nation. So for example, North and South Korea, well, North Korea is a highly repressive regime, and you would expect that under those circumstances, the average IQ would be lower just because malnutrition and other circumstances that come out of it. And that would be the thing that determines the success of the country, that actually it's this repressive regime that's holding the country back, not necessarily the IQs of the people within those nations. So I'm going to respond to his questions. I'm going to play his questions right now so you can see what he said, and I'll give you my best responses to both of his questions. So let's listen to what he has to say.
So the two questions I want to ask race realists are this. Number one, if IQ scores are the cause rather than the effect of economic prosperity and cultural development, then why do we see them fall and rise in different countries as I have shown?
So to respond to this question, let's look at IQ. Now, let's assume IQ is 100% environmentally influenced. Well, that means that if you take any person, you can use a good environment and make them the smartest person out there, because just provide a good environment and it will be that they'll become the best. Like, so if you took like a cat, for example, you could train the cat, provide all the stimulus to that cat, and that cat should become the next Einstein. Well, it doesn't work that way. So obviously it's not 100% biological. It's not that we inherit it's like I'm saying the wrong thing. It's not, obviously IQ is not 100%. Let me just start from the beginning on this one. So let's address his question. So if IQ's what the hell? Okay. So to address his question, I'm going to think of it this way. Let's say IQ has two major components to it, a biological and an environmental component. Now, if you believe that it's 100% biological, then in theory, you could take So to respond to his question, let's think about the two components that determine one's IQ. One is the biological component, their brain, basically. How much influence does that have over somebody's IQ? The second component would be their environment. How much influence does the environment have on the person's IQ? Now, if it's 100% environmental influence, then you would expect that you could take any person or any animal and basically provide really great environment for them, and they could become the next Einstein. So you could take a cat, give it a really great environment, and that cat will become the next Einstein. Just because it's 100% environmental, there's no biological component. Well, that doesn't really make sense. I've tried it with my cat, it didn't work. So no, it's not 100% environmental. Well, is it 100% biological? Well, that argument is equally as flawed, because if you say that it's 100% biological, then if you starve somebody so that they never can develop their brain, or you hit them or beat them so that their brain is kind of destroyed, Well, obviously that's going to have an impact on them. The environment has an impact on the person's brain as one of these two components that determine overall IQ of the person when it gets realized. So the question becomes, how much influence does the environment have on IQ? How much influence does biology have on IQ? Well, based on twin studies, they found that there's a correlation of 0.76 to 0.86, and I can cite a study, you can read it for yourself, that it's a biological component. So what happens is if you take two twins and you separate them at birth and you raise them in a good environment versus a bad environment, well, they will kind of correlate fairly closely to each other. Even though they grew up in very different environments, they'll have similar IQs. As well, if you took two children who are of different IQs, or backgrounds of different IQs, and you put them into an environment that is very nurturing, well, their IQs will still fall where you would expect them to be. Like you can't bring up the IQ that much through environment. So there's a limit to how much IQ gets influenced by the environment. There's almost like a set expectation from the brain for how good it can be or how smart it can be. The academic agent actually refers to height, and actually height is even more environmentally influenced. Nutrition really does play a huge role in one's height. But at the same point, there's a limit to how tall people can get, even if you feed them really well. Actually, if you overfeed a person, it can actually lead to shorter people, strangely enough. They're actually seeing heights go down in places like US, where people are being overfed and they're reaching maturity a little bit earlier and they're not actually reaching their full height. But that's beside the point. The point is that there's a limit to how much the environment can improve IQ. So even if it can improve it one standard deviation, which is a lot, that doesn't balance out the huge disparities that people are noticing between the different ethnicities and their IQs. It just doesn't balance it out. So there is this biological, you have to be somewhat realistic that there is this biological component that can't be ignored. And that is what race realists often push, to say, hey, look, there's a limit to how much you can improve people's IQ. And the races do have different IQs. The standard numbers that you hear are something like the average Asian IQ is anywhere from 102 to 104. The average white IQ is around 100. And the average sub-Saharan African IQ is anywhere from 60 to 70 IQ. So there's, even with the environmental influences, there's only so much that lower number can really be raised. So we have to be realistic about the numbers. And this is through hundreds of tests. IQ is one of those things that's fairly concretely known about people. It's been used for quite some time. So that would be my response to his first question. His second question I'll play right now.
Second, if IQ is such a strong indicator of success, then why did East Germany fail? And why has a country like Botswana been able to start lifting itself out of poverty?
Okay, so this is a good question. So if IQ is such a strong indicator of success, why would countries fail if they have low IQs? And if they have high IQs, well, take the example that he gave of East Germany. East Germany did fall. It failed miserably because it had a horrible regime, right? Well, you would think if IQ is such an indicator of success that it wouldn't matter what the regime is. The IQ would balance it out. That they could be so smart that they could be successful despite the oppressive regime. Well, that's just not very realistic. And this is not what race realists are saying even. This is sort of almost a straw man kind of question, but I'm going to let him have it. The point is that, yes, oppressive regime can negatively impact the economics and the success of a nation. That is just obvious. Venezuela is a very good example of that. I mean, they have everything going for them, but they have this horrible economic system of socialism that's just causing the whole country to collapse. Another thing you'll notice is when there is these horrible kind of systems, the smartest people usually are the ones that escape first. So it does actually negatively impact on the IQ of the national IQ levels, because the smartest people are usually the ones that have been successful in the past, have a little bit more resources, and can escape. So even if you look at, like, for example, Nazi Germany, during Nazi Germany, many of the smart Jewish people that lived in that time, they left. They saw the writing on the wall. They got out of there. Not all of them were able to escape, but the ones that did were some of the ones that actually helped the Allied armies win the war, because they were the smartest of the Jewish people. Einstein is a good example of that. So it's a misguided question, in my opinion. Yes, government structures impact societies. Another good example would be to look at China. You see, China has very smart people, average IQ of around 102, but they were held back for a long, long time by their government. Socialism, communism, is just a failed system. It doesn't work. Once the communist government within China sort of said, hey, we're going to let a little bit of a free market experiment happen, and they sort of embraced a little bit of capitalism, well, all of a sudden, the country started flourishing. So yes, you can see that effect, that smart people, when they're held back, well, they will be, you'll see the impacts of that. But once they're given the opportunity, they can help a country thrive very, very quickly. Another way of understanding this is that if you take his example of Botswana, well, the average IQ of Botswana is 76. And the majority of people are, it's actually one of the better areas of Africa, Botswana. It's really thriving right now. It's actually coming into its own in terms of economic development. However, with an IQ of 76, average IQ, that the overall population is going to be limited in terms of the high skilled labor that they can provide. So the problem is, yes, IQ can help countries kind of make a turnaround, and even countries with low IQs can make that turnaround to success if the system is a good system. So in Botswana, it's a good system. It's a capitalist system. So it's allowing for that turnaround. But just like a negative system can impact an intelligent group of people, or a highly intelligent group of people, it can also be limited in terms of how much it can really bring people up if it's a good economic system. So in Botswana, they had the British system that really was a very strong economic system that they maintained within Botswana. But that system can only do so much because you're limited by the people that you're working with. So yes, Botswana is doing a lot better now, but it's going to be limited in terms of how far it can take that growth. So I hope this answers the two questions and gives some insight into how race realism works. And I'd like to hear his response to my responses to his questions. And I hope you enjoyed this video. Thank you for listening to Socially Triggered. Bye for now.
Check this.